In 1979, the Ford family lost control of their $200 billion empire with a single phone call. But the man who made that call, he wasn't a Ford. And yet, he's still pulling the strings today. Henry Ford II thought he was saving the company. Instead, he triggered the quietest corporate coup in American history. A betrayal so subtle, the family didn't even realize they'd lost. Within a decade, the empire that built the American dream was no longer theirs. Not through scandal, not through failure, but through trust. Before we dive in, hit subscribe, because this isn't just the story of Ford. It's a warning to every family who thinks their name still means power. Picture this. It's 1903, and a 40-year-old mechanic named Henry Ford is standing in a tiny Detroit workshop with $28,000 in his pocket. That's about $900,000 today. He's already failed twice at building car companies. His investors think he's crazy. His wife Clara begs him to get a normal job. But Henry has a vision that will change everything. A car for every American family. What happened next created the most powerful industrial dynasty in human history. But here's what nobody tells you. It also planted the seeds of its own destruction. Henry Ford didn't just build cars. He built an empire that controlled every piece of the supply chain. He owned iron mines in Minnesota, rubber plantations in Brazil, and glass factories in Michigan. By 1925, the Ford Motor Company was producing one car every 10 seconds. Henry Ford had become the richest man in America, worth over $200 billion in today's money. But power like that comes with a price. And Henry Ford was about to learn that the hardest battles aren't fought in boardrooms. They're fought at the dinner table. Henry's only son, Edsel Ford, was everything his father wasn't. Where Henry was rough and stubborn, Edsel was refined and diplomatic. Where Henry saw cars as transportation, Edsel saw them as art. And where Henry trusted his gut, Edsel trusted data and market research. This difference would tear the family apart. In 1943, Edsel Ford died suddenly of stomach cancer at just 49 years old. Henry Ford, now 80 and increasingly paranoid, refused to let go of control. He fired executives who had worked with Edsel. He canceled Edsel's innovative designs. He even tried to write Edsel's children out of the company's succession. It was the first power vacuum in the dynasty, and it wouldn't be the last. But Edsel's widow, Eleanor Clay Ford, wasn't going to let that happen. She was the daughter of a department store magnate and knew how to fight. In a move that shocked Detroit society, Eleanor threatened to sell her family's Ford stock to outsiders unless Henry stepped down and gave control to her 25-year-old son, Henry Ford II. Henry Ford had no choice. In 1945, he handed over the company to his grandson. It was the beginning of a new era and the start of a 34-year countdown to betrayal. Henry Ford II, everyone called him the Deuce, was nothing like his grandfather. He was Harvard-educated, internationally minded, and absolutely ruthless when it came to business. When he took over Ford in 1945, the company was hemorrhaging $10 million a month. Within 5 years, he had turned it into the most profitable automaker in the world. But the Deuce had a problem that would haunt him for decades. He had no sons. Think about that for a moment. Here's a man controlling a $200 billion empire, and he's watching his family name slowly disappear. His daughters couldn't carry on the Ford legacy, not in 1950s America. His brothers had their own children, but they were more interested in philanthropy than pistons. So the Deuce made a decision that seemed smart at the time, but would prove catastrophic. He started hiring outsiders to run his family's company. In 1946, he brought in a group of former Air Force officers, led by Robert McNamara. Yes, the same McNamara who would later become Secretary of Defense. Among the rising stars in this new generation of managers was a young executive named Donald Peterson. Quiet, brilliant, and dangerously ambitious. Few people noticed him at the time, but decades later, he'd make a move that would change everything. Ford was running better than ever. Control, however, was already slipping. Because no matter how brilliant they weren't family. For 30 years, this system worked perfectly. Ford dominated the American car market. The Mustang became a cultural icon. The company's profits soared. The Deuce was hailed as a visionary leader who had modernized his grandfather's empire. But behind the scenes, something dangerous was happening. The professional managers were slowly taking control of the company's day-to-day operations. Board meetings that once featured heated arguments between Ford family members now became polite discussions between MBAs and accountants. The family was losing touch with their own empire. And then came 1979, the year everything changed. By the late 1970s, Ford was in crisis. Gas prices had skyrocketed after the oil embargo. Japanese cars were flooding the American market. Ford's quality had plummeted so badly that fix or repair daily became a national joke. The company lost $1.5 billion in 1979 alone. That's $6 billion today. The Deuce, now 62 and facing the biggest crisis in Ford's history, had to make a choice. He could promote a family member to help save the company, or he could bring in an outsider with the skills to turn things around. He chose the outsider. On January 15, 1980, Henry Ford II made the phone call that would end his family's control forever. He called Philip Caldwell, a career Ford executive who had never owned a single share of company stock, and offered him something no outsider had ever received: the position of CEO of Ford Motor Company. "Phil," the Deuce said, "I'm making you the first non-Ford to run this company. Don't make me regret it." But here's what the Deuce didn't realize. He had just handed over control of his family's empire to a man who owed him nothing. Philip Caldwell was a company man through and through. He had spent 35 years climbing Ford's corporate ladder, and he knew exactly how the system worked. More importantly, he knew how to change it. Within months of becoming CEO, Caldwell began systematically removing Ford family influence from the company's operations. He restructured the board of directors, bringing in more independent members. He reorganized the management structure, creating layers of bureaucracy between the Ford family and actual decision-making. He even moved the company's headquarters to a new building where the Ford family's historical presence was minimized. The Deuce watched all of this happen and said nothing. Why? Because Caldwell was saving the company. Under Caldwell's leadership, Ford's quality improved dramatically. The company introduced the revolutionary Taurus sedan, which became America's best-selling car. Profits soared. Stock prices doubled. Wall Street hailed Caldwell as a genius. When Caldwell retired in 1985, a familiar name took over as CEO. That quiet, ambitious executive from decades earlier? His name was Donald Peterson. And now he was stepping out of the shadows. But unlike Caldwell, who had at least maintained some respect for the Ford family's wishes, Peterson had bigger plans. He believed that family control was holding Ford back. He looked at companies like General Motors and Chrysler, which were run by professional managers, and saw them as more efficient and profitable. So he began a quiet but deliberate campaign to marginalize the Ford family. He restructured the company's voting shares, brought in outside investors with no loyalty to the Ford legacy, and even floated the idea of changing the company's name to something more modern and global. By the time the Deuce died in 1987, the company still bore his family's name, but real power had moved far beyond their reach. His son, Edsel Ford II, held a ceremonial board seat, but the decisions were made elsewhere. The Ford family, scattered across multiple generations and more interested in their philanthropic foundations than car manufacturing, barely noticed what was happening. They were rich, comfortable, and largely absent from the company's daily operations. By 1990, the transformation was complete. Ford Motor Company was still called Ford, but it was no longer controlled by the Ford family. Professional managers made all the major decisions. The board of directors was dominated by outsiders. Even the company's culture had changed. It was now a corporation. But here's the truly insane part. Peterson wasn't done. What came next nearly erased the Ford name from the company altogether. In the 1990s, he began pushing for something that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier: selling Ford to a foreign company. He held secret meetings with executives from Toyota, Honda, and even Volkswagen, exploring merger possibilities that would have ended Ford's independence forever. The only thing that stopped him was a revolt from an unexpected source: Ford's own employees. When word leaked about the potential foreign takeover, Ford's factory workers, engineers, and middle managers erupted in anger. These weren't just jobs to them. They were part of American industrial heritage. The United Auto Workers Union threatened strikes. Suppliers warned they would cancel contracts. Even Ford's dealers organized protests. Faced with this uprising, Peterson backed down. But the damage was done. The Ford family had been so marginalized that they couldn't even protect their own company from being sold to foreigners. And that's when the most shocking betrayal of all was revealed. In 1999, investigative journalists discovered that Peterson had been secretly negotiating with investment banks to take Ford public through a leveraged buyout that would have eliminated the Ford family's control entirely. The plan was to use Ford's own assets as collateral for loans that would buy out the family's shares, leaving professional managers in complete control of a company worth over $50 billion. The scheme was only discovered when a whistleblower leaked internal documents to the Detroit Free Press. The headlines were devastating. Ford family betrayed by their own executives. The end of an American dynasty. How professional managers stole a $50 billion empire. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe. Because the next company to lose its founding family might be the one you work for. But by then, it was too late to undo the damage. Today, the Ford family still owns about 40% of Ford's voting shares through a special class of stock. But their actual control over the company is minimal. Professional managers make all the operational decisions. The board of directors is dominated by outsiders. Even the company's strategic direction is set by executives who have no connection to the Ford legacy. William Clay Ford Jr., Henry Ford's great-great-grandson, serves as executive chairman, but it's largely a ceremonial role. The real power rests with CEO Jim Farley, a former Toyota executive who was hired specifically because he had no loyalty to Ford's traditional way of doing business. And here's the most ironic part of all. The man who orchestrated this transformation, Donald Peterson, is still alive at 98 years old. He lives quietly in a mansion outside Detroit, collecting millions in pension payments from the company he helped transform. When asked about his role in marginalizing the Ford family, he simply says he was modernizing an outdated business model. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened to Ford is now happening to family businesses across America. The same playbook that Peterson used, bringing in professional managers, restructuring voting rights, diluting family control, is being implemented at companies like Mars, Cargill, and Koch Industries. Investment banks and consulting firms have turned it into a science, helping family businesses professionalize their operations by reducing family influence. They call it corporate governance. The families call it theft. The Ford family's loss of control over their empire proves something terrifying about modern capitalism. In the end, ownership matters less than management. You can own 40% of a company, but if you don't control the day-to-day operations, you're just along for the ride. Henry Ford built an empire that employed millions of Americans and defined the 20th century. His family's name is still on the building, still on every car that rolls off the assembly line. But the dynasty he created? That died with a single phone call in 1979, when his grandson chose efficiency over family loyalty. And the man who orchestrated it all is still out there, proving that sometimes the most devastating betrayals come not from enemies, but from the people you trust to help you succeed. The Ford name is still on the cars, but the people who built it? They've been locked out of the driver's seat for decades. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.